Maisy Card is the author of These Ghosts Are Family, a richly layered family epic that explores the complexities of intergenerational trauma. This sweeping story is Maisy's first novel, but her writing has appeared in a number of literary publications, including the School Library Journal and the Sycamore Review. She has an MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College and an MLIS from Rutgers, but we're most proud to call her a Cardinal, having earned her bachelor's from Wesleyan in 2004. In conversation with Maisy this evening is Elizabeth Bobrick, a visiting scholar in Wesleyan's Department of Classical Studies. Through Wesleyan Center for Prison Education, she has taught Greek tragedy, mythology, and the first person essay, a course she taught for many years for Wesleyan's Department of English. Her publications range from scholarly articles on Aristophanes, Sophocles, and Theophrastus, to book reviews and essays on an array of topics from tragic heroes and baseball to Santa Claus and teaching anxiety. So who knows where tonight's conversation will lead. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Maisy, Elizabeth, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Erica. This is just great. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to everyone who's come this evening and this lovely spring promising evening. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here with Maisy and to have now read twice her incredible novel, These Ghosts Are Family. Everyone is used to books being praised to the skies, and then you read it, and then it's like, that first chapter, yeah, that was workshopped pretty carefully, but after that, right? But this book is a literary page turner. I couldn't put it down. I would have loved it whether it was written by someone I knew or someone I didn't. And so I can't urge you all strongly enough, get a copy for yourselves. So Maisy and I are going to chat a little bit about how she got started as a writer at Wesleyan, and then she's going to we're going to talk about various aspects of her writing since Wesleyan, and then take some questions. So the class that Maisy was in was called Creative Nonfiction, if I'm right about that, Maisy.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Yeah, I taught a bunch of these essay courses at Wesleyan, and they go by various names, but it was creative nonfiction, and we mostly read and wrote memoir essays. And Maisy sent me some of her student work the other day, and I was just blown away all over again. And when I got this, there are many talented young people at Wesleyan, but Maisy was one of those that really stood out. So how wonderful that she went on to write and share all the great stories that she had in her, beginning to be in her. So Maisy, did you want to talk a little bit about how that class led to fiction writing?
Sure. I decided to go to Wesleyan because I was interested in being a writer. And so kind of all 4 years that I was there, I tried to get into writing classes, but it was, pretty difficult, but I did manage to get into a couple of my junior and senior year. And I think I took your class maybe my junior year, I want to say.
Yeah.
That was the first time I'd ever done a creative nonfiction class, I think. And we were talking about this a little earlier, just that for some reason I realized when I look at the writing that I did in the other creative writing classes, I realized I never really felt comfortable writing about characters who looked like me. Like my family is Jamaican, everybody speaks, patois. And I realized I never incorporated that in any of the fiction that I was writing in creative writing classes. It was, I tended to write these characters that were kind of like ethnically ambiguous, or race wasn't mentioned, without really knowing why. And I think why is probably just because, the examples we were being given, weren't, weren't featuring characters like me. So I just didn't feel comfortable kind of bringing those stories into, the classroom. But I think, when I took your class and, we had to write about something personal, that was the first time that I started to imagine, what characters who are like me, who are Jamaican, who are Jamaican American, like what they look like, in the context of a narrative. And, I had also been taking, I think I took Kate Russian's class at the same time I was taking her Caribbean literature class. So I was reading a lot of Caribbean literature too. So that was also an influencing. But I feel like, I wrote this, I remember I think the first essay I wrote was, it was a story about me right before I started college. I got hit by a car. And it was when I was doing something, I was going somewhere my mother had told me not to go. And I was fine, but she came to the hospital and she kind of yelled at me. And I kind of remember writing out that conversation in full, like her patois. And, that was the first time, like you had a lot of really positive feedback. And, that was the first time when I guess I just tried to imitate my mother's voice and that kind of lyricism. And I just, it was just such a big influence on me. And I think I just kept writing about just family from that point.
Well, I am so happy about that. And I don't know if I ever shared with you, Maisy, that I spent some time in the Caribbean, not in Jamaica, but in St. Croix. I ended up going to high school in St. Croix. So there were people in St. Croix from many different islands, some Jamaican. So I had heard some patois. And but it's also, the way you capture it is so lively, it's so audible that it just adds such a texture to the story. So I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about what kind of people you felt comfortable writing about. You said, in other classes, you weren't sure whether they should be like you. I think you said something when we were talking the other day about your characters were non-specific. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just, I don't know, I did another, I was doing an event with somebody I went to the MFA program with, and, he was mentioning something that a classmate had said to him when he would, after he had submitted a bunch of stories, and it was that, do you just want to be a Black writer? Or, don't you realize you're just going to be thought of as a Black writer if you keep presenting these stories with, Black characters and like talking about race? And I feel like, even though I never got that message overtly, I think probably I got it a bit subconsciously. And that's why I never kind of felt comfortable just putting those characters on the page. And it's also, I think, since I was young, since middle school onward, I've kind of been used to kind of being one of the only or few Black students in the class. So I think that, changes like sometimes it can change how the work is read. So yeah, I think I just subconsciously was just kind of like afraid, and also had not seen, had not really like been presented with that work without me actively seeking it out. At Wesleyan, I was an American Studies major, I was in ethnic studies, that was my concentration. So I was like seeking out literature, by people of color, by people like me. But yeah, I think growing up in the context of most English classes that I'd taken before, I just didn't come across like a lot of writing like that I ultimately wanted to do. Mm-hmm. So I didn't actually know I wanted to do it at that point until I actually took your class.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, there's nothing like writing, right? You don't, when you land on the right thing, it's like this wonderful mystery that happens. Speaking of writing, would you like to read some of your book at this point?
Sure. I'll actually read on screen. I'm going to read for people who haven't read it, These Ghosts Are Family, it's a novel and stories. So each section is self-contained. And I'm going to read the end of the second chapter. And the book is about a Jamaican family, the Paisleys, and it focuses on kind of the family patriarch, Abel Paisley, deciding to fake his death. So I'm going to read like a little chapter that's kind of set in Jamaica. It's set in 1966 on the day that Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, comes to Jamaica. And this is kind of the end of the chapter where Abel, he realizes his wife is cheating on him, and he decides to try to shoot the man who is his wife's lover. So this chapter is called The Lamb and the Lion. Abel tails behind a line of Rastas who are allowed through the gates and escorted onto the tarmac by gun-toting soldiers. He stands in front of the barricades, set up to fence in the onlookers as if he is on duty. He places his hand on his gun and feigns alertness, but he is scanning the crowd looking for Roman. He is readying himself and rationalizing his actions as if this were Judgment Day. He is preparing himself for what comes next, even though he doesn't know what that will be. When he shoots Roman, will a soldier shoot him in return, or will he be convicted and executed later? Either way, he soon will meet his creator, for after he dispatches Roman, one way or another, he too must follow. The drizzle ceases, and in mere minutes, the sun emerges in full force. People applaud as they hear the roar of the plane overhead and take the sudden shift in weather as confirmation that they are in the presence of the divine. The Rastas clap harder and beat their drums with fervor. Someone sounds the abeng. The sudden horn blast makes Abel jump. The plane descends lower and lower just above their heads, but it hovers as if reticent to land because of the size of the crowd. Abel wants to have Roman in his sights before the people rush the tarmac. He can feel that the crowd is already surging toward the barricades. He walks along the fences, searching, and spots Roman, neck craned upward, eyes tracking the plane above. The crowd is momentarily hushed as the plane's golden lion emblem becomes visible. As Abel pushes through the onlookers to meet Roman, he is certain that he is the only person moving. When he reaches Roman, he sees the man shows no fear. In fact, he smiles, puts a hand on Abel's shoulder, then turns his gaze back to the plane above him, mouth agape as if waiting for Abel to insert the barrel of his gun. Abel calls on God, bully, whomever, to guide his hand and give him the strength to take a life. He puts his hand on his gun and starts to pull it out of his holster, but he feels a sudden force pushing his hand back down, stopping him. Then he feels a wave of heat concentrated on the back of his neck, so he turns to confront it. But the force is not God, it is his wife. She puts her hand together as if in prayer, pleading with him. As all eyes are on the plane continuing its descent, Abel's eyes are focused on his wife's hands, waiting for them to change shape, to spell out a new way forward for them. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I wrote Maisy after I read her book, and I said, I can't quite figure out yet how, but the prose simply kind of hurtles forward without being at all simplistic. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I hadn't really had a chance to ask you about what you worked out as a style for this. What did it start in a different way? Did you evolve this very rather stark but vivid style? Tell me a little bit about that, or tell us.
Yeah, I think it all kind of evolved over time. I think I was a very different writer when I started. I spent about like 12 years, writing it, and I started. It started as short stories, like individual short stories. But it's interesting because I had forgotten when I started talking about the book that the tiny piece, like the story I read, actually came from an essay I wrote in your class.
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, I had forgotten about, and it was you had given an assignment, and it was to I can't remember the essay we read, but it was to write about a story that you heard that happened before you were born that you couldn't have been present for.
Yes, I remember that one. That assignment that I do every year, and the essay, by the way, is by Anne Panning, and it's called "Remembering I Was Not There."
Yeah.
That's when you see who are the writers in class. Uh, because you have to. I write everyone that you write about a scene that happened before you were born. You've heard about it in family stories. We want to know these characters. We want to hear the dialogue. We want to see everything, and that's where the writers show up. I usually do it about halfway through class, and it's not always the people you think are going to be. Although Maisy's have been beautiful all along. I'm not sure if people know that this is in some way. This is historical. What do I want to say? I don't want to say historical fiction. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I would say in part it's, because it's a novel and stories, different chapters have like a different kind of different genres even. Like I think it's multiple genres in one book. And yeah, there are a couple stories like the chapter that I read that focus on historical events. Yeah, so from, so that section, The Lamb or the Lion, started from me writing that essay in your class about my father. Like the reason we came to America was because he was a police officer in Jamaica, and he was in a car accident and his partner was killed and he was injured. And so, he couldn't do that work anymore. And so he immigrated. So, I kind of wrote that story. And so and I put it aside. And then years later, when I started the Brooklyn College MFA program, that's when I kind of started to write the story. And so, the premise is that Abel, the character, he was in an accident and his partner has died. And, his partner's kind of haunting him. So I think, a lot of the chapters in this book begin maybe with like a memory or a story I heard. But yeah, I think they just kind of evolved over time, and a lot of them, they're all very fictionalized. There's very little, fact in this book, but I think a lot of what I did towards the end, maybe why the prose kind of started to change, is that I started to like record a lot of it out loud, like read it out loud, record myself, listen to myself. I'd have like other people read it. Just to make sure that it had that, I guess, urgency, or that it flowed. And also because, obviously my parents are Jamaican, and I was born there, but I don't actively like speak patois. So it was important to me to like, hear it and make sure it matches, what I grew up with. But yeah, and I think the form kind of helps it flow too, because kind of the novel and stories format, I could kind of play around with time, and I could kind of, it's kind of just give people like a bird's eye view, and then kind of hone in on specific moments in these characters' lives.
Yeah, I mean, it is, the book begins with, well, you can't see it. You got a copy of your book with you?
Yeah.
Okay, can you show folks the family tree?
Yeah, sure.
Because when you open up the book and you see the family tree, you think, oh, historical fiction, cool. They usually start at the top. Okay, a little further back because it's a little too close up. There we go. So it usually starts at square one, with Florence there, who is an enslaved person, born in 1796, and then moves down all these generations.
Yeah.
And one of the things I especially loved about the book was that it didn't go in chronological order. You had that family tree, so you could refer back and see where you were in time, but it was just a checkpoint. It wasn't like a puzzle where you had to figure out what's going on, like Don DeLillo or something. Each story is completely fully there and engaging, but they're related to each other in such an interesting time. And I love it that you did not go, it would have been a great book as, chronologically, but it works the way memory does. Memory is not chronological. It goes back, forward. The further back, the less sure you are about the truth, but does it matter? because a certain truth has been passed down to you.
Yeah, and I wanted it to kind of imitate the way we kind of learn about family history, you know, especially if you are from like if you are a Black person in the Caribbean or in the Western Hemisphere, you know, and like slavery in some form has disrupted your tree and prevented you from kind of having a full picture of, you know, your genealogy. You know, I think, you know, you rely on like these like oral histories, these stories, and you kind of like, you do get more of a like, it's all like kind of conjecture, I guess. Like, you know, I think I think what I didn't want to do, and I enjoy family sagas, that's kind of my favorite genre, but it's most of them will have this complete tree, you know, going back 400 years and all these questions will be answered. And I think I wanted it to kind of reflect more of reality where, you know, there's just so many questions that we can't answer, so many people that we can't really account for because those records have been erased. So I wanted to kind of play with that a little bit with the tree.
Right. And a mystery or a secret of some violent event is at the center of the stories often, right?
Yeah.
The part that you just read of that chapter immediately follows the induced abortion of Abel's wife with the baby that she's gotten pregnant by her lover, the man that Abel goes to the airport to shoot as the king Haile Selassie of Ethiopia arrives. Such an incredible moment of his family with this, you know, Haile Selassie is coming to Jamaica. That's a big deal for the, you know, Rastafarians, and yet it's completely overshadowed by this terrible moment in this family's lives. And isn't that the way it is? You know, we think, you know, history is this grand event, but it's a backdrop to people's lives. And you did that so well. And a lot of it is very painful. The story of Isabel, who's enslaved in is it sugarcane plantation?
Yeah.
Yeah. And all the suffering that she goes through. So when Maisy and I were talking a couple of days ago, I said that on the second read, when I had time, you know, when I wasn't just, you know, what happens now, and I could slow down and think about it. It reminded me actually of the literature in which I was my formal training is, and that's in classical literature and Greek tragedy and Greek mythology, and it struck me that this idea of an original violent act, a crime, a lie, of familial violence is at the heart of Greek tragedies. Pretty much all of them. There's always a big history, you know, going back. You have to know all this backstory. And so I thought and the way it moves around in time, this is has a very mythical feel to it.
Yeah, I don't know if that was intentional. But yeah, I think I was just kind of, I was actually thinking a lot, I think when I decided it was going to be a novel, I was thinking a lot about my, you know, my actual real grandfather. And I was just thinking about the ways in which, you know, his actions have changed, like you know, the kind of course of, you know, my own life. And, you know, he's why I'm in America, you know, and so I just wanted to kind of reflect on how, you know, people have this like imprint on your life without you realizing it. And that, you know, history has like an imprint on you without you really realizing it. But yeah, I think, you know, I did think about Greek tragedy a little at certain places when I was writing. And I know in some stories I did want to like insert like a chorus, like I intentionally inserted that too. And I think also it was kind of influenced by horror, like both like books and film. And I think at the heart of those movies too are always like kind of familial violence too. And I hadn't realized it, until I started writing it. And so part of what I wanted to do too was like put a different kind of like horror motif in like all throughout, or some element of the supernatural all throughout the book.
Right. And the last chapter is very much a horror story. It's a really surprising departure from what's come before. And I wondered if you would mind talking, just giving a little description of that last chapter. Maybe, I don't know if you want to read a little bit from it and talk about endings, because it's hard to end books and they're seldom satisfying. And this one was, because it just took off in another way. What do you think?
Sure. I'll just read like a little paragraph from that last story. Yeah, because it does take a very different form. It's basically like supposed to be a folk tale. It ends with a kind of folk tale based on Jamaican, specifically Jamaican folklore. And so throughout the book, I kind of mention it, and it's this kind of figure. She's called the Old Hag, and she's kind of like in some islands, I guess she's more depicted as like a witch, and some she's kind of more of a vampire. But she's an older woman who lives in the community and appears normal. And then kind of at night, she's supposed to be able to take off her skin. And sometimes in some stories she flies, in some stories she turns into cats or owls. And, she can like either suck your blood or your life force out in kind of the middle of the night. And, when I read about the origin of the myth, that it was what they usually told when a baby died, kind of unexpectedly. It was the idea that the Old Hag was the one who did it. And to protect babies, I think they would, like leave the Bible open next to the crib, or hang, my mother would mention this, like hang a kind of ruler, like a ruler above the bed or something, so you're kind of like a foot away from the devil or something. So there are three little girls who are at the end of one chapter, they kind of are kidnapped and disappear, and then they kind of reappear in this story, transformed and kind of evolving into these like witches. So it's called How We Were Born. So I'll just read the first chapter. Birth. In Harrow Town, they tell their children the story of the three little girls who followed a man into the bush. He had no children of his own, so he promised that he would grant their every wish if they would be his daughters. The girls agreed to leave their mothers, and they walked for a few days with the man. When they stopped, they found that there was no one around for miles, just grass, flowers, and trees. They had to build a little hut themselves. The man had nothing to give them. They were tricked, they'd realized. When he fell asleep, they tried to go back home to their mothers, but they only got lost in the dark. The man found them again, told them that they would never find their way out of the bush on their own, and he would never show them. So the girls gave up and lived together with the man peacefully for a short time, pretending he was their father. Then the girls became very sick. The man loved them so much he couldn't stand the thought that his three little girls might die. One special night when the moon glowed red, he said he would show them a cure that his grandmother had taught him. He gave them something to drink. It tastes like blood, they said. He told them to drink it all, for he had to leave soon, but not to worry. In the end, his leaving would only make them stronger. In the morning, people from the town found his body at the bottom of a ravine. They had thought he was just another weak-minded man, driven mad by the blood moon. No one knew his name, so they buried him quietly. And then the rest of the story kind of focuses on the different townspeople and their experiences of these like three little girls. And we just kind of jump around through different characters. And I just really wanted to, I just kind of thought about the way that folklore kind of evolves, and, how, because a lot of this book is about trauma. And I think, folklore is used to kind of as a way to process like community trauma. And I thought, what was what's going to be left, you know, after this family's story is complete. It's probably just this kind of folklore. A lot of the actual facts of the events will be gone, you know, and they'll just have these stories that they tell their children. So I kind of wanted to end that way. I know it kind of, some people do not like it because it's such a departure, but yeah.
No, I thought it was great. I mean, it was really surprising. But one of the things that's often disappointing about novels is they don't know how to end. They think they have to tie everything up neatly, or it just kind of peters out, or something really unbelievable happens. And I like, you just went for it. Because before then, everything, folks, is very real, described in a very realistic way. There is, you know, magic, you know, and this last chapter, suddenly we're in the middle of a world filled by ghosts, and dangerous ones. And it's creepy, especially little kid ghosts. I don't know, there's something about little kid ghosts that's just the worst, right? Because it's such a, it's like the sweetness of childhood turned inside out into this grisly thing. So I loved what you did. I thought it was really bold, and I thought that it brought the book back to its center, which is Jamaica, and little girls disappearing for very terrible reasons.
Yeah, and also one thing that I forget to mention too is that, you know, a lot of the origin story of a lot of the characters is this fictional town called kind of Harold Town in Jamaica, you know, and that's where the kind of Abel Paisley character comes from, and that's where you know, another major character comes from. And so yeah, I wanted to you know, yeah, and with this kind of return to the specific place where this family kind of sprung from.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell folks what Abel's, what what in mythology would be called the spur of the family secrets? What is it that Abel did? Can you tell folks about that?
Yeah, so it begins, and I think it begins in the way that, like, I guess some Greek tragedy begins in that I begin by telling you, you know, basically what's going to happen in the book. But
the first chapter I'd forgotten. Maisy tells us everything that happens, and then you get so wound up, caught up in finding out what happens that you completely forget that you know, because you don't know, you just know what happened. Okay.
Yeah, so the first chapter, you know, it starts with Abel. Actually, it starts with a man named Stanford Solomon trying to confess to his daughter that he basically faked his own death, and that he was born Abel Paisley, and 30 years ago he kind of assumed his dead friend's identity, and he's been living under this assumed name for 30 years in Harlem. You know, and he brings the daughter and so the reason he did this was just to abandon his family and kind of abandon his responsibility in Jamaica. So he kind of starts this new family, the Solomons in America. And so, you know, that's why if you look at the family tree, it's kind of like a dividing line. It was like hard to, I guess, visualize, to know how to visualize, but I tried to just show that he was the same. He was both Stanford Solomon and he was Abel Paisley, and he had created these two families.
Yeah, a divided self, literally. And yes, that took some doing in your chart. And that's one of the enticing things too about the book, when you open up and look at it and say, wait, you know, this person seems to be two people. And isn't everyone in some way? So I'm wondering is there something you would like one little bit more that you'd like to read, and then we can, I think you've only read such a little bit. I think people, I can see some of my writer friends in the chat nodding and saying, don't tease us with these little tiny bits anymore. So maybe something a little longer. How about that? What do you feel about the beginning?
Yeah, okay. I'll read the first part, and it's called the True Death of Abel Paisley, and it's set in Harlem 2005, and it's written in second person, and it kind of bounces, the you kind of bounces from different characters in the household. But I'll read the section that focuses on Abel. Let's say that you are a 60-year-old Jamaican man called Stanford, or Stan for short, who once faked your own death. Though you have never used those words to describe what you did, at the time you thought of it as seizing an opportunity placed before you by God. But since your wife, Adele, died a month ago, you've convinced yourself her heart attack was retribution for your sin. So today you have gathered 3 of your female descendants in one house, even the daughter who has thought you dead all these years, and decided that you will finally tell them the truth. You are not who you say you are. You have spent the last 20 years of your second life living in a brownstone in Harlem, running a West Indian grocery store. Recently, you shuttered the store. You have given up on fighting your arthritis pain and are finally sitting in the wheelchair Adele picked out. You are looking out of your parlor window, waiting for your daughter, the one who thinks you are dead, to arrive. It's been 35 years since you've seen her, so you study each woman who passes your house for reflections of yourself. You haven't bothered to shave, press your clothes, or comb your hair. You are ready to be still and rot. You imagine the death of Stanford Solomon, unlike the abrupt end of Abel Paisley, will be achingly slow. Already it feels like you are losing small pieces of yourself daily. To you, old age is a torture you deserve, a slow, insignificant death, your matter dispersing into the air like dandelion seeds until the days there's nothing left. When you died the first time, you were still a young man in your 30s and had been working in England for less than a year. It wasn't easy for an immigrant, especially a Black man, to find a decent job back then. But through a boy you'd known back in primary school, Stanford, you'd gotten a room and a job on a ship. You had no idea it was just the beginning of your streak of good luck. You and Stanford were the chosen wogs they allowed to work alongside the white men. Stanford complained often about London. He hated the cold. He missed his grandmother and the tiny village, Harrowtown, where you'd both grown up back in Jamaica. You'd already escaped the countryside for Kingston, and from there, London. You felt free. That sense of freedom and joy only dampened when you thought of the family you left behind. Your first wife, Vera, wrote you long letters weekly about how you'd abandoned her and left her to become a dried-up old spinster. But you both knew perfectly well that it was her idea for you to go to England, where she thought you'd somehow become a better provider. Your son, Vincent, was still in Vera's womb when you sailed off. Your daughter, Irene, a stumbling toddler. You had barely settled in when Vera's first letter arrived with a list of things you wanted to buy and send them. With every letter, the list grew longer and you worried that you would never be enough. The day you died, you were running along the dock because you were late for work while a container was being lowered onto the ship. You stopped short when the container fell, dropped from the crane, and thundered against the deck. You were close enough to hear the screaming. "Who was it?" you heard someone shout. "One of the wogs," another answered. "It's Abel." For a moment, you were confused, hearing yourself pronounced dead. It was like one of those movies where the dead person's spirit stands by watching as a crowd gathers around his body. But no, you were certain it wasn't your body, so you boarded the ship. The captain approached you immediately and said, "I'm sorry, mate, no way Abel could have survived that." You almost laugh now when you think of it. The one-time racism worked in your favor. The captain had gotten his wogs confused, looked you right in the eye, and mistook you for the other Black guy. Abel was dead, crushed under the container, unrecognizable. But you, Stanford now, could turn and go home. Perhaps it's telling about your nature that you did not hesitate. You nodded and turned and walked away quickly from Abel and all his responsibilities before any of the others had a chance to recognize you. I'll stop there.
I hadn't seen the word wog in print since I read Rudyard Kipling as a kid. I don't know. Do you want to explain that word to folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically just like a slur that's specific used to describe Black people and immigrants, you know, in a certain time period in Britain.
Yeah.
So the book, it doesn't take place in England, but it kind of begins there. That's where Abel fakes his death, and then he decides to kind of move to Harlem to kind of get away from that memory.
right. And the British are um, uh, tremendously present in Jamaica as slavers. Um, and then, as you described so beautifully, even as they leave and Jamaica um, becomes a country for itself, there's still those who pine for a kind of colonial identity. And that, that is just adds to the richness of the personal histories interwoven with, the history and the destiny of your country, which is never separate, as we Americans are finding out to their great astonishment. Right? Um, you know, I will ask you one more question, and that is how you decided to start the book with "Say You Are," and you introduced each of your characters that way in this first chapter. You heard the first one. Do you remember, or did it just happen?
Actually, the first chapter was one of the last chapters that I wrote. So yeah, I think I had tried to write it, and I knew that the premise was that Abel Paisley faked his own death, and I mentioned it in other chapters, but I hadn't actually written out the story of him faking his death. Yeah, so I think I tried it in first person, third person, and I realized that I just didn't want it to be. I guess I wanted to play with the amount of empathy that he got, and I wanted to focus more on understanding, I guess, than forgiveness or empathy for that particular character. I wanted people to understand, and then so I think I think I was just playing around with the second person, like just because I just didn't know what to do, but I kind of liked the feeling of kind of jumping into Abel's body just for a short time and then jumping out and getting kind of the perspective of, for people who haven't read it, it goes on to his wife, his dead wife, actually, who's a ghost, to his daughter, who he abandoned, his daughter who he raised, and his granddaughter. And it's kind of just getting him from these different perspectives. But you start out by trying to kind of inhabit his body and kind of see what he sees and try to understand why in that moment he kind of made that decision.
Yeah.
So yeah, I liked the "let's say" because yeah, it allowed me to kind of switch and jump bodies and change the you all throughout the story.
Yeah, I thought it was a brilliant device. Soon to be stolen. Okay. Well, shall we take questions?
Sure.
Okay. Good folks at RJ Julia, do we have anyone who has questions or would like to hear some more read, or you let us know.
All right. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, and I want to encourage anyone else who has questions as they think of them to send them in the chat, but we'll jump right to it. Maisy, do you remember anything that surprised you as you were linking your stories together and as you were writing?
I think what surprised me was, the theme of like kind of the supernatural, like not that I intended it to be in some stories, but then in some stories it kind of just appeared. And then I realized that I wanted to kind of intentionally keep pushing that kind of motif all throughout. And also, I guess the ways that that historical events were incorporated. I think, I hadn't intended to, like I said, the story with Haile Selassie was written based on like an essay or a true story. But then as I started to read more about, Jamaican history, I kind of saw, it just came to me to just kind of set things during specific periods in time so I can incorporate these events.
Sure, absolutely. And you did talk a little bit in your conversation with Elizabeth about being inspired by your own family history a little bit as you wrote. But who are some other inspirations as you think about your writing? Are there other people in your life or other authors that you're inspired by?
Yeah, a lot of Caribbean, writers. Michelle Cliff is one of my favorite writers. Edwidge Danticat is one of my favorite writers. I think for a long time, I feel like there are a lot of books being published now, you know, by Caribbean authors. But yeah, I feel like when I was in the like 90s, there were just like a few authors that I would go to regularly. Yeah, and definitely Kate Russian's Caribbean Lit class was a big, you know, influence on her, because that's where, on me, because that's where I first read, you know, A Bang by Michelle Cliff and No Telephone to Heaven, you know, and Patricia Powell. So those writers have always been influential to me.
Any titles off the top of your head? I mean, you of course mentioned some incredible writers, but any books that you kind of find yourself returning to again that you're inspired by?
Yeah, actually, I like to read like A Mercy by Toni Morrison a lot. Like whenever I feel stuck, I reread that book.
Oh, I love that.
Mm.
And as you speak and write your words, who do you imagine as listening to you? So who's your imaginary audience as you're creating your stories? I can tell that we have writers in the audience tonight.
I feel like I have multiple kind of audiences. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of kind of being in, you know, like in a diaspora, I guess. Like I kind of think about people like me, you know, people who are Caribbean who were raised in the United States, or like immigrants who've had similar experiences. But then I also think about like what actually like Jamaican people in Jamaica would say about my book. And I, you know, I think with this book, I struggled with a lot with questions of like authenticity and like, you know, do I really understand the experience since I wasn't there? So I think I always had that like my mother, like like in the back of my head, and just thinking about what she would think about you know, certain parts of the book.
Did that ever stop you from writing? Did you sort of find yourself like that self-critic sort of stopping you from the creative process, or did you find that to be a positive influence?
I think it's more of a neutral thing. But I don't, you know, I think you know, you just have to write whether, you know, even if you're, you know, that even if you're worried that you're going to get the criticism. And I always like, just because I'm neurotic, I always think about what everybody, all the possible outcomes, but you know.
Sure. Absolutely. I think anyone who's putting like a creative project out into the world always has that those heart flutters. But we're very glad that you finished the project and birthed it to us. Once your book was accepted for publication, did you have to do any additional editing?
Oh yeah, I did a lot of editing. Yeah, we didn't cut a lot. We actually expanded a lot. Just because, you know, I guess the book is about connections, and it is, you know, a novel in stories, and not every story seem like the connections are totally apparent. So I think, you know, my editor just had a lot of questions and how characters were connected. And, you know, as I tried to answer her questions, it just got longer and longer and longer. So when we sold the book, it was like over 60,000 words, but when we edited it, it became like over 90,000 words. So yeah, we added a lot.
Oh, wow. And are you working on anything next?
Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm under contract for another book. Yeah, and it's but it's set in America, but it does feature, it's about, you know, Jamaican characters, these Jamaican women working as home health aides in a wealthy retirement community in Florida.
Ooh, very exciting. So let's turn a little bit to reading. What have you been reading? And I know, you know, you mentioned, of course, a ton of authors that you're inspired by, but what have you just been keeping up with while you've been reading in lockdown?
You know, I've been reading, fortunately, like some people that I know have had books come out. Like I recently read The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. And, you know, we were in the MFA together, and, you know, we did a program together once his book came out. I've been reading.
Does he have the James Baldwin blog? Is that right?
Yeah, he's son of Baldwin, yeah.
Oh, I love that. I'm teaching a course on Baldwin this summer, so I need to, maybe you can hook me up with him. I need to talk to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, it's funny because, yeah, we talked about that because, yeah, our books came out, you know, very close together, and we were the same year. Yeah, I'm trying to think, you know, I read The Vanishing Half which
Oh,
yeah.
loved it.
Yeah. And I'm reading a book by a Caribbean author now, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House.
Ooh.
And I mean, just because I'm teaching creative writing now, I'm reading like this book, Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salesi's, which is, yeah, I feel like it's a very innovative, like he talks about kind of the issues that Elizabeth and I were discussing, just how, you know, the kind of pressure to conform to kind of the workshop and maybe not create characters that, you know, feel authentic to you. Yeah, it's just kind of about how kind of traditional workshop structure, yeah, kind of is difficult for writers of color. That's basically, but it's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can elaborate on that for those of you who haven't been in a writing workshop, you end up having your fellow students and your professor to some extent telling you whether or not your characters or your story is authentic or valid. And that's why I don't do as you may remember, I have people share work, but I don't think I don't think other people know your story until you know it. And when you know it, then they can take it or leave it. But there has been a lot of talk now about deracializing, if that's the right word, the writing workshop. Is it the right word? Or de-whitening it? I don't know.
Yeah, there's actually another book that I have that I haven't started reading yet, but yeah, Decolonize. It's like, I think it's decolonizing the,
yeah.
Oh no, the book is called The Anti-Racist Novel Fiction Workshop, but yeah, I feel like decolonizing the workshop is something that Matthew Salesi's talks about.
Yeah, yeah.
And so one final question, I guess, that segues really nicely from, you know, talking about authenticity. What do you, Maisy, want your readers to take away from These Ghosts Are Family?
You know, I think what I've liked to hear from people is, and especially like I've heard a lot from Caribbean people, just that it helps them kind of talk through kind of difficult subjects, I guess, with their families, or ask kind of difficult questions. You know, I think when I started writing it, part of what I was thinking when I was thinking about my grandfather was that there's so much that I hadn't asked him, you know, and it was when I realized that he had dementia, we were starting to realize that he had dementia, and I realized that, you know, it's too late to kind of work through all these issues that we have as a family. So I kind of created this fictional family to work through them. But yeah, I think, you know, my hope is just that it makes people think a little bit more about their family history and kind of think about the questions that they want to know, I guess, before it's too late.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I think something that anyone with a family can certainly take away from the book. Well, thank you both for joining us this evening. Elizabeth, thank you for moderating our discussion. And Maisy, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful writing with us, your thoughts on the craft. These Ghosts Are Family is available for sale, of course, at Wesley and RJ Julia. And at RJ Julia Booksellers. We have signed book plates that Maisy was gracious enough to send us. So we have signed copies available while supplies last. Links are in the chat or visit us in store. And thank you all again. We hope to see you soon for another virtual event.